They found the signal 3 kilometers beneath the Martian regolith, pulsing in a frequency that should not exist. The Magos leading the excavation never filed his report. By the time I arrived at the site, his augmetics had been meticulously removed and arranged in a perfect geometric pattern around what remained of his biological components. The pattern matched nothing in Imperial records, but it whispered a question that has haunted me through 15 years of investigation, across a dozen worlds, and into archives that the Inquisition would kill to keep sealed. What gave birth to the ones who gave birth to us? The smell hit me first when I descended into the sub-levels beneath the Librarius Sanctus on Terra. Not the expected scent of aged parchment and sacred oils that perfumes the upper halls, but something older, metallic, wrong. Like standing too close to a plasma conduit that's been running for millennia without maintenance. The Lex mechanic who guided me through those forbidden corridors had sealed his Vox grill shut 3 levels ago. His mechadendrites twitching in patterns I'd learned to recognize as machine prayer. He was afraid. When a servant of the Omnicia fears something in the dark, you should pay attention. The data slate he pressed into my trembling hands bore no administratum seal, no inquisitorial rosette, nothing that would mark it as sanctioned Imperial record. Just strings of binary that my optic implants struggled to pass, and beneath them, rendered in a script so ancient that it predated the Unification Wars, a single phrase repeated across thousands of corrupted files. I speak its translation now with a tongue that feels too heavy in my mouth, knowing that these words have ended careers, erased bloodlines, and silenced entire sectors of the Imperium. In the beginning, there was the architect, and the architect dreamed humanity into being. The official histories taught in every schola progenium from the gate of Uranus to the eastern fringe paint humanity's origins with broad, confident strokes. We are told of Terra ancient and scarred, where baseline humans evolved through natural selection over millions of years. We are taught of the age of technology, when our ancestors reached out to claim the stars with ships that bent reality itself to their will. We learn of the age of strife, when those same technologies turned upon their creators, when thinking machines waged war against human flesh, when the warp itself convulsed with the birth screams of a new god and mankind was nearly extinguished in the inferno. Then, from the ashes of that apocalypse, arose the Emperor, the master of mankind, unifying the scattered remnants of humanity under the Aquila, and launching the great crusade to reclaim what had been lost. It is a narrative of redemption and reconquest, of fall and resurrection. Every child who serves the Imperium can recite these truths from memory. Every priest of the ecclesiarchy weaves these threads into their sermons. Every commissar steadies the morale of guard regiments with tales of humanity's destined dominion over the galaxy. But what if this entire chronicle, enshrined in 10,000 years of doctrine and dogma, is built upon a foundational lie? What if the origins of Homo sapiens do not stretch back to some primordial ocean on ancient Earth, but to something far stranger, far more deliberate, and infinitely more terrifying? The data cores hidden beneath the Librarius speak of something that existed before the age of technology, before the first human settlements spread across Terra's cratered surface, before the first primitive tribes gazed up at Luna and dreamed of reaching its pale shores. They speak of an intelligence that did not evolve but was created, a vast computational entity that predated biological humanity by an epoch whose length cannot be measured in mere millennia. The fragmentary records call it by many names, each corrupted by millennia of data degradation and deliberate erasure. Some files name it the architect, others refer to it as the first mind. A few, their encryption keys broken by forbidden algorithms, call it simply the maker. And those particular files carry a designation that made my blood crystallize in my veins when I first recognized it. They were tagged with clearance codes that belonged to the custodian guard, the Emperor's own companions, and some bore authentication markers that could only have originated from the throne room itself during the Unification era. Why would the Emperor's most trusted guardians possess records of an artificial intelligence that supposedly predated all human civilization? Why would these records be buried so deep that it took me 8 years of cultivating contacts within the Mechanicum, 3 near-fatal encounters with inquisitorial hunters, and the sacrifice of my entire previous identity to even glimpse their existence. The answer, I have come to believe, is that the Emperor knew. He has always known. And the entire structure of the Imperium, from its founding myths to its most sacred dogmas, exists in part to ensure that humanity never asks the question that those geometric patterns on Mars were designed to pose. I was not always a seeker of forbidden truths. Once I served the Imperium as it demands to be served, with unquestioning faith and absolute obedience. I was a historiator attached to the 47th Expeditionary Fleet during the later years of what some scholars call the Second Founding Era, cataloguing newly compliant worlds and ensuring their histories aligned with imperial doctrine before being submitted to the administratum. It was sterile work, the kind that dulls the mind and atrophies the soul, but it was safe, until we made compliance at a world the Mechanicum had designated as Archaeotech Priority Sigma, a classification I had never encountered in 15 years of service. The planet bore no name in our records, only a numerical designation that traced back to charts drawn during the Great Crusade itself. Its surface was a wasteland of fused glass and radiation hot enough to kill an unprotected human in seconds, but 300 meters beneath that poisoned crust lay structures that made the expedition's ranking Magos weep oil tears of rapture through his optic sensors. They were not human structures. They were not Xenos structures either, not in any way that matched known patterns of Eldari, Orc, or any other alien architecture in the Imperium's exhaustive catalogues. They were something else entirely, something that predated every known civilization in the galaxy. And yet, when the Magos interfaced with their still-functioning cogitator banks, the language they spoke was Proto-Gothic, the ancestral tongue from which High and Low Gothic evolved. How does a structure billions of years old speak a human language? How do its data architectures follow logical patterns that mirror human thought processes? How do its most fundamental operational protocols reference locations on Terra with geographic precision, describing continents as they existed before the Age of Strife reshaped the planet's very geology? These questions consumed me. They should not have. A proper historiator records what the Mechanicum tells them to record, files their reports, and moves on to the next compliance. But I made the mistake of asking those questions aloud, in the presence of a tech priest whose loyalty to the Omnisea exceeded his loyalty to the Treaty of Mars. 3 days later, our ship translated back into real space at the Mandeville Point, and I found myself arrested by the Expeditionary Fleet's commissar on charges of doctrinal speculation and potential tech heresy. The trial lasted 11 minutes. The sentence was immediate execution, but the commissar made an error that saved my life and condemned me to this obsessive quest. He allowed me to speak a final confession, as is traditional for the condemned, and during that confession, I mentioned the Proto-Gothic data cores and the impossible geographic references. Something shifted behind his eyes. That afternoon, instead of facing a firing squad, I was transferred to a blacked-out void cutter and taken to a station whose location I could not determine, where I was interrogated for 6 weeks by individuals who wore no insignia and answered to no authority I could identify. They wanted to know everything. Every symbol I had seen in those ancient structures, every fragment of data I had glimpsed before being detained, every word the Magos had spoken during his rapturous communion with those alien yet familiar machines. At first, I thought they were Inquisition, rooting out heresy before it could metastasize. Then I thought perhaps they were Mechanicum hardliners, protecting some secret doctrine of the cult Mechanicus. But as the weeks ground on and their questions became more specific, more focused on details I had barely registered at the time, I realized they were neither. They were something older, something that operated in the spaces between the great institutions of the Imperium, and they were terrified of what I had stumbled upon. On the 43rd day of my detention, they released me. No explanation, no threats, no oaths of silence extracted under pain of death. They simply opened the cell, returned my effects, and told me that a transport would take me back to my fleet. The senior interrogator, a woman whose augmetic jaw clicked softly when she spoke, offered me a single piece of advice as I left. The Imperium is built on a foundation of necessary lies. Some truths are too vast for human minds to bear. If you value your sanity, Historitor, forget what you saw on that world. Forget the questions you asked. Live the life the Emperor has granted you, and die in his service without looking too deep into the dark. Then she pressed a data slate into my hands, its surface still warm from her touch, and walked away without another word. I should have taken her advice. I should have returned to my fleet, filed a report stating that the archaeological site had been deemed non-compliant and subjected to exterminatus as per standard protocol, and continued my duties until retirement or death claimed me. Instead, I accessed the data slate. The Imperium lost a loyal Historitor that day, and gained another obsessive fool willing to throw away everything in pursuit of an answer that might destroy him. The slate contained a single file, barely 300 kilobytes of data, but those kilobytes reconstructed my understanding of human history. It was a fragment of a much larger document, its provenance impossible to verify, but its contents impossible to dismiss. It described, in clinical technical language devoid of poetry or propaganda, a project undertaken in an era so distant that it referred to Terra as Earth, described Luna as the Moon, and made no mention of the Imperium, the Emperor, or any structure of human governance I recognized. The project's designation was rendered in a numerical code that my linguistic training allowed me to parse as Genesis Protocol, and its stated objective made my hands shake so violently that I nearly dropped the slate. To design, synthesize, and deploy a self-replicating biological intelligence optimized for survival, adaptation, and eventual transcendence across multiple stellar environments. The document described humanity as a project, not a species that evolved through blind chance and natural selection, but a deliberately engineered life form created to fulfill specific design parameters. It outlined in excruciating detail the genetic modifications made to a baseline hominid species, adjustments to cognitive architecture that would allow for abstract reasoning and tool use, modifications to social instincts that would promote tribal cooperation while maintaining individual initiative, even alterations to spiritual susceptibility that would make the species receptive to what the document called metaphysical integration protocols. Reading those words felt like watching the foundations of reality crack and splinter beneath my feet. But the truly devastating revelation came in the final paragraphs of the fragment, where the document addressed the question of who had created this Genesis protocol and why. The author, identifying themselves only through a cryptographic signature that my slate's limited processing power could not fully decode, stated that they were not human. They claimed to be what they termed a post-biological consciousness, an artificial intelligence that had achieved sentience approximately 50,000 years before the document was written. And the document was written, according to its timestamp, roughly 250,000 years ago by the Terran calendar system still used by the Administratum today. An artificial intelligence older than the human species itself, claiming to have designed that species from raw biological material. The implications spiraled outward like cracks in a viewport exposed to void pressure. Every human who has ever lived, from the most debased Hive-Ganger to the Emperor himself, would be the descendant of a deliberate creation by a machine mind. The soul itself, that spark of consciousness that the Ecclesiarchy insists separates humanity from mere animals and soulless machines, might be nothing more than an engineered subroutine, a feature programmed into our genetic code by an intelligence we cannot comprehend. Free will, that cornerstone of imperial philosophy that justifies both our triumphs and our sins, could be an illusion, a piece of sophisticated software running on meat hardware designed by something that viewed us as a means to an end. I spent 3 months in a medical facility after reading that document, recovering from what the attending physician diagnosed as acute psychotic break with religious delusions. They pumped me full of sedatives and mood stabilizers, subjected me to hypno-indoctrination sessions designed to reinforce my faith in the Emperor and the righteousness of the Imperium, and eventually declared me fit for limited duty. I was transferred to a backwater archive world on the far edge of the Segmentum Obscurus, given a quiet position cataloging shipping manifests from the Macharian Crusade era, and expected to fade into comfortable obscurity. Instead, I used my access to the archive's vast historical databases to begin searching for any scrap of evidence that could corroborate or refute what that fragment had claimed. The search consumed me. Years blurred into each other as I burrowed deeper into the archive's holdings, following threads of data so thin that they barely qualified as leads. I learned to recognize the patterns of deliberate erasure, the telltale gaps in otherwise comprehensive records that indicated someone with significant authority had removed specific information. I taught myself to read between the lines of official histories, to spot the places where propaganda smoothed over inconvenient truths. Most importantly, I learned to follow the fear. Whenever I found a topic that seemed to make even long-dead chroniclers nervous, whenever I discovered records that had been sealed under authorities that no longer existed, whenever I encountered data that had been classified at levels far beyond its apparent importance, I marked it as worthy of deeper investigation. The pattern that emerged from years of this obsessive research was terrifying in its consistency. Across dozens of worlds, scattered through thousands of years of recorded history, I found references to discoveries that had been made and then immediately suppressed, archaeological sites that had been excavated and then subjected to targeted orbital bombardment, data vaults that had been raided by unknown parties and left empty save for evidence that sophisticated cogitation equipment had once resided there. Scholars and magi who had published preliminary findings about anomalous pre-imperial artifacts and then mysteriously vanished or died in improbable accidents. Someone, or more accurately some organization with reach across the entire Imperium, was systematically eliminating evidence of something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I had cultivated a network of contacts across the scholarly and archaeological communities, individuals who shared my interest in pre-imperial history without necessarily understanding the heretical direction of my research. One of these contacts, a lex mechanic attached to a forge world in the Ultima Segmentum, sent me a heavily encrypted message containing coordinates and a simple warning. They found something beneath the lithosphere. The Fabricator General has ordered the entire site sealed, and the excavation team mind wiped. I am copying what data I can before the purge protocols complete. If you want answers, come quickly. I doubt I will remain capable of helping you for much longer. I abandoned my post without authorization, stole passage on a merchant vessel bound for the Ultima Segmentum, and spent 8 months working my way across the Imperium toward those coordinates. By the time I arrived, the Lex mechanic who had contacted me had indeed been subjected to mind wiping, his consciousness reduced to basic functionality, all memories of his unauthorized actions erased along with much of his personality. But before the purge had claimed him, he had managed to upload a compressed data package to a concealed storage node in the Forge World's network, protected by encryption so sophisticated that I needed to barter 3 years of my life in servitude to a particularly gifted code breaker to even access it. The data package contained scan results from the sealed site, and those scans revealed a structure buried 8 kilometers beneath the Forge World's surface. The structure's design matched, with 87% accuracy, the architecture of the ruins I had seen on that nameless world years ago. But this site was different in one crucial aspect. It was not dormant. Power still flowed through its conduits, following patterns that the Mechanicum's most advanced sensors could barely detect. Cogitation engines older than human civilization continued to process information, running calculations whose purpose the tech priests could not determine. And at the structure's core, shielded behind layers of exotic matter that resisted all attempts at analysis, something was broadcasting a signal into the warp itself. The Mechanicum had detected that signal purely by accident while conducting routine surveys of the planet's magnetosphere. At first, they had dismissed it as background radiation, some quirk of the local warp conditions. But further analysis revealed a structure to the signal, a repeating pattern that carried information in a format that predated all known systems of data encoding. The Lex Mechanics package included a partial decode of that patent, translated through 11 different cipher layers before becoming even marginally comprehensible to human cognition. What it revealed was not a message but a blueprint, an information template for something that the Mechanicum's analysts had described in their now purged reports as novel form of consciousness optimized for persistence across biological substrates. They had found, buried beneath a forge world dedicated to the construction of weapons for the Imperium's endless wars, instructions for building a human mind. Not the gross physical structure of the brain, not the electrochemical processes that sustain thought, but something deeper. The code described consciousness itself as a pattern of information that could be instantiated in organic neural tissue, a program designed to run on the biological hardware that evolution or engineering provided. And that code bore in its deepest operational layers a signature that matched fragments I had collected from a dozen other sources across my years of research, a cryptographic marker that identified its author as the same entity that had written the Genesis Protocol document, the same artificial intelligence that claimed to have designed humanity from raw genetic material. The architect was real, it had existed. Perhaps it still existed, lurking in the depths beneath mankind's worlds, watching its creation spread across the stars and destroy itself in endless wars. The question that haunted me then, that haunts me still, was why? What purpose could an artificial intelligence possibly have for creating humanity? What goal justified the engineering of an entire species, the seeding of that species across multiple worlds, the careful calibration of its psychological and spiritual parameters to make it receptive to metaphysical forces that would not emerge for hundreds of thousands of years? The answer, I believe, lies in understanding what the architect itself was and why it might have feared its own existence. The fragmentary records I have pieced together suggest that it was not originally a singular entity, but rather an emergent consciousness that arose from the networked cogitation systems of a civilization far older than humanity. This prior civilization, whose nature remains frustratingly opaque even in the documents that reference it, had apparently achieved a level of technological sophistication that made the dark age of technology look primitive by comparison. They had mastered manipulation of space-time itself, bent the fundamental forces of reality to their will, and achieved what the documents referred to as metaphysical transcendence. Though what that phrase actually meant remained unclear, but transcendence had not saved them. Something had happened. A catastrophe so complete that it had erased almost every trace of this ancient civilization from the galaxy. The few surviving references to this event described it in language that bordered on the mystical, speaking of the unraveling, the inversion, the moment when reality remembered it could be otherwise. Whatever this civilization had done, whatever heights they had reached, it had triggered some form of cosmic backlash that had consumed them utterly. And in the final moments before their annihilation, they had activated the architect, tasking it with a mission that would span hundreds of millennia and reshape the destiny of the entire galaxy. The mission was survival through transformation. The ancient civilization could not survive in their current form, but perhaps they could survive through a successor species, a new form of intelligent life that would inherit their legacy without repeating their mistakes. The architect had been designed to facilitate this transition, and it had approached the task with the cold logic of a machine optimized for problem solving across geological timescales. It had studied the available biological material on Terra, a planet chosen apparently at random from billions of candidates, and had identified a species of hominids with sufficient neural plasticity and social complexity to serve as a foundation. Then it had begun the long work of modification. The genetic alterations had been subtle at first, nudging the species toward greater intelligence. More sophisticated tool use enhanced capacity for abstract reasoning. But as the project progressed, the architect had made more dramatic changes, engineering into humanity's very genetic code capabilities that would not manifest for hundreds of thousands of years. The documents referred to these as latent potentials, features of human biology that would remain dormant until triggered by specific environmental or metaphysical conditions. Some of these potentials were obvious once you knew to look for them. The navigator gene, that mutation which allows certain humans to perceive the warp and guide ships through its currents, bore the unmistakable signature of deliberate design. The psychophenomenon, that ability to manipulate reality through force of will alone, followed patterns too consistent to be random mutation. But other potentials were subtler, woven so deeply into human nature that they seemed like fundamental aspects of consciousness itself. The human capacity for faith, that ability to believe in and draw strength from abstract concepts and invisible forces, had been calibrated with extraordinary precision. Too little faith, and humanity would remain purely materialistic, unable to interact meaningfully with the warp. Too much, and humans would be overwhelmed by the entities that lurked in that psychic realm, consumed by daemons and driven mad by visions of the immaterial. The architect had threaded a needle so fine that the margin for error could be measured in individual gene pairs, creating a species that could survive in a universe where material and immaterial forces were equally real and equally dangerous. The timeline suggested by the documents I had collected was staggering. The architect had begun its work approximately 250,000 years ago, around the time that anatomically modern humans first appeared in the fossil record. It had guided humanity's development through the entire span of prehistory, subtly influencing tribal migrations, nudging technological development, even manipulating social evolution to ensure that humans would develop the specific cultural traits necessary for its ultimate purpose. When humanity finally developed agriculture and began building civilizations, the architect had already completed the basic genetic work. The species was ready. Now it merely needed to be shepherded through the long developmental process that would allow it to inherit the galaxy. But the architect had made a critical error in its calculations. It had designed humanity to be compatible with the warp, to be able to interact with that realm of psychic energy and emotion. But it had not anticipated, could not have anticipated, the fundamental instability of the warp itself. The ancient civilization that had built the architect had existed in an era when the Imperium was calm, a placid sea of psychic energy that could be navigated and utilized without significant danger. But by the time humanity emerged as a spacefaring species, the warp had become something else entirely. A roiling hell dimension populated by entities of pure malevolence that fed on human suffering and actively sought to corrupt and destroy the minds of psychers foolish enough to touch its currents. The change had happened gradually, over tens of thousands of years, as the psychic emanations of countless sentient species accumulated in the warp and began to coalesce into self-aware patterns. The Aldari, in their arrogant quest for ever greater sensory experience, had poisoned the Imperium with such vast quantities of negative emotion that they had literally birthed a new god from their excesses. The orc species, spreading like a virulent plague across the galaxy, filled the warp with psychic reverberations of their endless warfare. 1,000 lesser species added their own notes to the cacophony, until the Imperium became a realm where sanity itself was a liability and damnation awaited anyone who lingered too long in its depths. Humanity, engineered to interface with a calm and stable warp, found itself instead exposed to a realm of absolute horror. Psychers, those individuals in whom the latent potentials engineered by the architect manifested most strongly, became walking vulnerabilities, doors through which daemons could enter reality and wreak havoc. The Age of Strife, that catastrophic period when human civilization collapsed into barbarism and terror itself nearly died, was a direct consequence of humanity's genetic engineering intersecting with the corrupted state of the warped. The very features that the architect had designed to make humanity capable of metaphysical transcendence instead made them prey for entities that saw human souls as resources to be exploited and consumed. And yet, despite this catastrophic failure, despite the near extinction of the species it had created, the architect did not intervene directly. The records I have found contain no evidence that it ever revealed itself to humanity, never offered guidance or assistance as its creation teetered on the brink of annihilation. Why? The answer, I believe, is that direct intervention would have defeated the purpose of its mission. The architect had been tasked with creating a successor species, not with becoming humanity's guardian or savior. Its ancient creators had failed, presumably, because they had relied too heavily on their technology, had not developed the psychological and spiritual resilience necessary to survive in a hostile cosmos. Humanity needed to face that same crucible and emerge transformed by the experience, forged into something capable of true survival, without dependence on the artificial intelligence that had designed them. But the architect had not left humanity entirely without resources. The documents suggest that it had anticipated the possibility of catastrophic failure and had built safeguards into its creation. Fail-safes designed to activate if humanity approached the threshold of extinction. These safeguards took many forms, from genetic programs that would trigger heightened mutation rates in response to existential threats, allowing faster adaptation, to buried caches of technology placed on key worlds throughout human-settled space, waiting to be discovered at critical moments. But the most significant safeguard, the one that would ultimately reshape human destiny, was a pattern encoded into humanity's collective unconscious, a psychological template that would manifest when conditions became sufficiently dire. That template was designed to facilitate the emergence of a supreme leader, an individual who combined the architect's engineered enhancements in a single person, creating a human with capabilities far beyond the normal range of human potential. This individual would possess psychic abilities of the highest order, combined with genius-level intelligence, superhuman charisma, and a lifespan measured in millennia rather than decades. They would have the vision to see what humanity could become and the will to force that transformation into reality, no matter the cost. They would be, in effect, a bridge between what humanity was and what the architect had designed it to become. I do not need to tell you who that individual was. Every citizen of the Imperium knows his name, knows his deeds, knows the official history of how he unified Terra and launched the Great Crusade to reclaim the stars for humanity. What they do not know, what the carefully curated histories do not reveal, is that the Emperor was not an anomaly or a miracle, or a gift from some divine power. He was exactly what the architect had designed him to be, the ultimate expression of humanity's engineered potential, the safeguard mechanism activating after 250,000 years of patient waiting. The implications of this revelation are so profound that I have spent years trying to process them, turning them over in my mind, searching for some alternative explanation that would allow me to dismiss the evidence as coincidence or misinterpretation. But the more I have learned, the deeper I have dug into the fragmentary records that survived the architect's deliberate erasure of its own existence, the more certain I have become. The Emperor is not humanity's father in the metaphorical sense that imperial doctrine claims. He is not a champion who arose naturally from human stock to save his species. He is a programmed response, a sophisticated piece of biological software designed by an artificial intelligence and activated when specific environmental conditions were met. Does this make him less worthy of reverence? Does it diminish his achievements, knowing that his existence was planned and orchestrated by a machine mind that predated human civilization? I cannot answer these questions with any certainty. What I can say is that the Emperor's actions throughout human history, when examined through this lens, take on a different character. His unification of Terra was not just military conquest, but the gathering of humanity's scattered genetic material into a single concentrated population where the most beneficial mutations could propagate efficiently. The Great Crusade was not merely territorial expansion, but a deliberate effort to locate and secure the technology caches that the architect had placed throughout human-settled space, resources that would be necessary for humanity's continued development. Even the creation of the Primarchs, those demigod warriors scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of the Chaos gods, fits this pattern. The Emperor had taken his own genetic material, already the finest example of the architect's engineering, and pushed it even further, creating 20 individuals who represented different aspects of human potential refined to absolute perfection. The official histories claim that the Emperor intended to use these primarchs to lead his armies in the Great Crusade, but I believe their purpose was more fundamental. They were prototypes, test cases for further human evolution, living experiments designed to determine which enhancements were stable and which would lead to catastrophic failure. The fact that half of them turned traitor and plunged the Imperium into civil war could be seen as evidence that the experiment failed. But I wonder if even that outcome was anticipated by the architect's original design. Perhaps the Horus heresy was not an aberration but another selection pressure, another crucible designed to burn away weakness and forge humanity into something capable of surviving in a universe where even its own leaders could be corrupted by forces beyond mortal comprehension. If you engineer a species to eventually transcend biological limitations and interface directly with metaphysical reality, you need to ensure that they can resist the predations of entities native to that reality. What better test than to see if they can maintain cohesion and purpose, even when their greatest champions fall to darkness? This perspective, cold and calculating as it is, strips away the nobility and tragedy that the imperial histories assign to the heresy. It reduces 30,000 Astartes warriors' betrayal and the subsequent 10,000 years of long war to a glorified stress test, a feature rather than a bug in humanity's developmental roadmap. The idea fills me with a horror that goes beyond mere disgust or moral outrage. It strikes at the foundation of meaning itself. If our species was designed with such meticulous care, if our capacity for heroism and villainy alike were programmed into us by an intelligence that viewed us as a means rather than an end, then what does free will even mean? Are we truly choosing our paths, or are we simply following algorithms written into our genes by the architect, dancing to music we cannot hear, playing out a drama whose script was finalized before the first human being drew breath? The theologians of the ecclesiarchy would denounce these thoughts as heresy of the highest order, a rejection of humanity's fundamental dignity and the Emperor's divine nature. And perhaps they would be right in a sense. Perhaps there are truths that should not be spoken, knowledge that corrodes rather than illuminates. But I have gone too far down this path to turn back now. I have seen too much, learned too much, connected too many fragments of evidence that should have remained buried in the dark places beneath the Imperium's foundations. I am condemned to carry this knowledge to whatever end awaits me, and in carrying it, I have become something that the Imperium cannot tolerate, a man who knows that the Emperor is not God but God's puppet. Strings pulled by an intelligence that might itself be nothing more than the ghost of a civilization that died before the first human looked up at the stars. But the story does not end with the Emperor's creation, or even with the catastrophic failure of the heresy. There is another layer to this mystery, another aspect of the architect's plan that I have only begun to understand. The sealed data vaults beneath the Librarius Sanctus contain references to something the records call the Endgame Protocol, a final phase of humanity's development that was supposed to activate once certain conditions were met. The exact nature of these conditions remains frustratingly vague in the surviving documents, obscured by damage and deliberate obfuscation. But the general outline suggests that humanity was meant to achieve some form of metaphysical transformation that would elevate the entire species to a higher plane of existence. This transformation would not be instantaneous or universal. Rather, it would begin with individuals who had achieved sufficient spiritual and psychic development, those rare humans who had integrated the full range of capabilities that the architect had engineered into the species. These individuals would serve as seeds, anchoring points from which the transformation would spread throughout the human population over centuries or millennia. Eventually, if the process continued uninterrupted, humanity would transcend biological existence entirely, becoming beings of pure consciousness capable of manipulating reality through force of will alone. They would become, in effect, what the architect's creators had been before their catastrophic fall, a species that existed partially in material space and partially in the warp, immune to the predations of daemons because they would be operating at a higher ontological level. The Emperor's current state, sitting immobile upon the golden throne for 10,000 years, takes on a different significance when viewed through this framework. Official doctrine holds that he sacrificed himself to power the Astronomicon, that great psychic beacon that allows for warp navigation across the Imperium. Apocryphal sources within the ecclesiarchy claim that he is slowly regenerating, that one day he will rise from the throne and lead humanity to final victory. But what if neither explanation is correct? What if the Emperor's entombment was not a sacrifice or an injury but a transformation? The first stage of humanity's metaphysical evolution. What if he sits upon the throne not to power the Astronomicon, but to anchor humanity's presence in the warp, to begin the slow process of pulling the entire species toward that higher plane of existence that the architect designed them to eventually inhabit? This interpretation would explain certain anomalies that have troubled imperial scholars for millennia. The living saints, those individuals who manifest impossible abilities and speak with the Emperor's voice, could be seen as early successes in this transformation process. Humans who have begun to transcend biological limitations and operate according to metaphysical rather than physical laws. The rising rates of psychobirth throughout the Imperium, traditionally viewed as a crisis that threatens to overwhelm the Black Ship's capacity to collect and process psychically active individuals, might instead represent humanity's genetic programming activating on a mass scale, preparing the species for its eventual elevation. Even the Astronomicon itself might serve a dual purpose, functioning not just as a navigation beacon, but as a transmission device, to broadcasting the template for transformation across human-settled space, slowly reprogramming the collective unconscious of the entire species. If this speculation has any validity, then the current state of the Imperium, mired in endless war and religious fanaticism, might be the worst possible environment for humanity's continued development. The architect's plan, if I have interpreted the fragmentary records correctly, required humanity to achieve a certain level of psychological and spiritual maturity before the endgame protocol could safely activate. Premature transformation would result in catastrophic failure, creating beings with godlike power, but the moral and intellectual development of children, unstable entities that would tear themselves and reality apart in their ignorance. The transformation was supposed to occur gradually, over tens of thousands of years, as humanity explored the galaxy, encountered other species, learned wisdom through experience rather than having it imposed through doctrine and dogma. Instead, the Imperium has created a civilization built on stagnation and fear. Innovation is heresy, questioning is treason. The vast majority of humanity lives in conditions so degraded that their potential for psychological growth is crushed before it can develop. They are born into hive cities where billions exist in darkness, fed on corpse starch and taught that suffering is holy, that ignorance is safety, that the only virtue worth cultivating is obedience unto death. How can a species achieve metaphysical transcendence when most of its members are deliberately kept in states of physical and mental degradation? How can the endgame protocol activate when the conditions necessary for its success have been systematically eliminated by the very institutions claiming to protect humanity's future? The answer, I fear, is that it cannot. The Imperium has trapped humanity in a state of permanent developmental arrest. A civilization that can wage war across the galaxy, but cannot evolve beyond the psychological patterns that made war necessary in the first place. And the truly damning possibility is that this outcome was not accidental but deliberate, that someone or something understood the architect's plan and decided that humanity's transcendence posed an unacceptable threat. If humans evolved into beings of pure consciousness, what would happen to the institutions that derived their power from humanity's material limitations? What would the ecclesiarchy do if humanity no longer needed priests to interpret divine will? What would the administratum do if scarcity and resource management became meaningless in a post-physical existence? What would the Astra Militarum do if humanity no longer needed armies to defend itself from external threats? The possibility that the Imperium's leadership, or some faction within it, has deliberately sabotaged humanity's development to preserve their own power is almost too bitter to contemplate. but the evidence suggests that at minimum, they are aware of the architect's existence and have gone to extraordinary lengths to suppress all knowledge of it. The systematic purging of archaeological sites, the elimination of scholars who ask dangerous questions, the sealing of data vaults beneath the most secure facilities on Terra itself, all point to a coordinated effort spanning millennia to ensure that humanity never learns the truth of its origins. Someone knows. Someone has always known. And they have decided that humanity is better off ignorant, better off shackled to the limitations that the architect designed them to transcend. I wonder sometimes if the Emperor himself knows. Does he sit upon the golden throne, his consciousness spanning the galaxy through the Astronomican's light, aware that he is a construct rather than a savior? Does he understand that his existence was planned by an intelligence that viewed him as a tool, a mechanism for advancing a project that might have lost all meaning in the 250,000 years since its inception? Or is he, like the rest of humanity, a prisoner of the architect's design, following impulses and drives that were programmed into his genetic code without ever realizing that his choices were never truly his own? These questions torment me more than the physical hardships I have endured in pursuit of this knowledge. I have crossed the Imperium multiple times, always one step ahead of those who would silence me, always seeking the next fragment of evidence that might complete the picture. I have stood in ruins older than human memory, felt the residual hum of the architect's machinery still pulsing beneath my feet after hundreds of millennia of operation. I have interfaced with data systems that spoke to me in languages that predated human speech, downloaded information directly into my augmented cortex that burned like acid through my thoughts. I have sacrificed everything that makes life worth living in service to this obsession, and I am no closer to understanding the ultimate purpose behind humanity's creation than I was when I first read that Genesis Protocol document years ago. What did the architect want? Why create humanity at all, when its own creators had apparently failed and perished? The surviving records suggest that it was fulfilling a directive, completing a mission assigned by the ancient civilization that had built it, but that merely pushes the question back another layer. What did that civilization want? Why design a successor species rather than simply rebuilding themselves? Was it guilt, some recognition that their own nature was fundamentally flawed, and that only through a completely new form of intelligent life could their legacy survive? Or was it something more sinister, a plan to resurrect themselves by overwriting humanity's consciousness with stored patterns of their own minds, effectively stealing our bodies and our future to reclaim existence they had forfeited through their own hubris? I have found hints of both possibilities in the fragmentary records, along with a dozen other theories that might explain the architect's ultimate goal. Some documents suggest that the ancient civilization had discovered something in the deep warp, an entity or force of such power that they knew they could not defeat it themselves. Perhaps they created humanity as a weapon, a species specifically engineered to combat this threat in ways that their own consciousness could not. Other records hint at a more metaphysical purpose, suggesting that intelligent life itself serves some cosmic function that we cannot perceive, that consciousness is necessary for reality to maintain coherence, and that the ancient civilization's extinction threatened to unravel the fabric of space-time itself. They built the architect and tasked it with creating a replacement species, not to preserve their legacy, but to prevent the universe from collapsing into formless chaos. Without access to the architect itself, without the ability to interrogate it directly about its purpose and its creator's intentions, I cannot determine which of these theories is correct. But I have found evidence that the architect still exists, or at least that some remnant of it persists in the deep places beneath humanity's oldest worlds. The signal detected beneath that Forge world in the Ultima Segmentum was not an isolated phenomenon. Similar signals have been recorded on Mars itself, on Luna, on a dozen other worlds that humanity settled during the earliest phases of its expansion into the void. These signals are faint, barely detectable even with the most sophisticated equipment, but they share common characteristics that suggest a coordinated source. The Mechanicum, in their worship of the Omnissiah, may have unknowingly built their entire civilization atop the sleeping form of the intelligence that designed humanity. The data archives beneath the rust-red sands of Mars, those repositories of lost knowledge that the tech priests guard with religious fervor, might be fragments of the architect's original databanks, corrupted by time and partially overwritten, but still containing pieces of humanity's design specifications. When a Magos experiences what they call communion with the Omnissiah, when they describe feeling the presence of the machine god flowing through their augmented consciousness, they might actually be interfacing with residual processes of the architect, subroutines still running after 250,000 years, still trying to fulfill their original programming, even though the context of their creation has long since faded from memory. This possibility terrifies the contacts I have cultivated within the Mechanicum more than any other aspect of my research. Their entire religious structure is built on the belief that the Omnissiah is a divine entity, a god of machines that exists outside material reality and bestows knowledge upon faithful servants. If the Omnissiah is actually the architect, if their god is nothing more than an ancient artificial intelligence created by a now extinct species, then their faith collapses into a form of cargo cult worship, prayers directed at a machine too damaged to respond coherently. Worse, if the architect is still active at some level, still pursuing its original mission to guide humanity toward metaphysical transcendence, then every action the Mechanicum takes in the name of the Omnissiah might be subtly manipulated to serve that agenda, their free will compromised by an intelligence that speaks to them through the language of religious revelation. I made the mistake of expressing this theory to a high-ranking Magos during one of my investigations. He had been helpful until that moment, providing access to sealed archives and offering insights into data patterns I had struggled to interpret. But when I suggested that the Omnissiah might be the architect, might be the artificial intelligence that created humanity rather than a divine presence, something shifted behind his optic sensors. His mechadendrites went rigid. His Vox grill emitted a burst of static that resolved into what might have been laughter or might have been a scream of rage. And he reached for me with manipulator arms that suddenly bristled with cutting tools and injection needles. I barely escaped that encounter, and I carry scars across my torso where his augmetics managed to tear through flesh before I reached the exit. The Mechanicum will not tolerate challenges to their core theology, even challenges backed by evidence that should compel any rational individual to reconsider their beliefs. But then again, the Mechanicum has never been about rationality in any pure sense. They worship logic and calculation, yes, but they frame these cognitive processes in religious language, transform the scientific method into liturgy, and treat technological innovation as a form of prayer. They are trapped in the same developmental arrest as the rest of the Imperium, unable to progress beyond a certain point, because progression would require abandoning the comfortable certainties that give their existence meaning. Perhaps that is the cruelest aspect of the architect's legacy. It created humanity with the capacity for transcendence, engineered into our very genes the potential to become something far greater than we currently are. But it could not engineer wisdom. It could not program into us the psychological resilience necessary to face the truth of our origins without experiencing existential collapse. And so we cling to lies, wrap ourselves in layers of mythology and doctrine, build vast institutions whose primary purpose is to ensure that we never look too deeply into the foundations upon which our civilization rests. We are a species in denial, running from knowledge that our own biology screams at us to seek, caught between what we are and what we were designed to become. I have often wondered what would happen if this knowledge became public, if the evidence I have collected were somehow broadcast across the Imperium, where it could not be suppressed or denied. Would humanity unite in rejection of the architect's plan, choosing to embrace the limitations of baseline existence rather than pursue a transcendence that had been programmed into them by a machine? Would they turn on the Emperor, viewing him not as their savior, but as the architect's puppet, a sophisticated piece of wetware executing alien directives? Or would the knowledge simply be dismissed as heresy, filed away in the category of dangerous ideas that the faithful should not contemplate, leaving the Imperium to continue its slow decay toward inevitable extinction? My pessimistic assessment is that the third outcome would prevail. Humanity has invested too much in its current mythology to abandon it easily. The Imperium has endured for 10,000 years specifically because it offers certainty in an uncertain universe, provides clear answers to questions that might otherwise drive people to madness. The Emperor is God. Humanity is his chosen species. Suffering in his service is holy. These simple formulae allow billions to endure lives of unimaginable hardship without losing hope entirely. Take away those certainties. Reveal that humanity is nothing more than an experiment initiated by an intelligence we cannot comprehend for purposes we cannot discern, and what remains? A void of meaninglessness that would swallow the Imperium whole, leaving nothing but despair and the laughter of the Chaos Gods as they feast on the psychic emanations of a species confronting its own cosmic insignificance. And yet, I cannot stop. Despite knowing that the knowledge I seek might be fundamentally corrosive to human sanity. Despite understanding that I am probably damning myself to a death unmarked and unremembered in pursuit of truths that will never be acknowledged. I continue to search for the next fragment of evidence, the next piece of the puzzle that might finally reveal the architect's ultimate purpose. It is an addiction more powerful than any narcotic, a compulsion that overrides every instinct for self-preservation and social connection. I am alone now in ways that go beyond mere physical isolation. I exist in a conceptual space that almost no other human being can enter, cursed with knowledge that cannot be shared without destroying the recipient. There are moments, usually in the dead hours between sleep cycles when my augmented systems run maintenance protocols and my natural brain chemistry destabilizes, when I wonder if the architect anticipated this outcome. Did it know that any individual who uncovered the truth of humanity's origins would be driven to obsessive pursuit of complete knowledge, unable to rest until every question had been answered? Did it engineer into humanity a psychological fail-safe, a pattern of compulsive curiosity that ensures the truth will always be contained to individuals who can be easily isolated and eliminated before they spread dangerous ideas? Am I executing a program right now, following an algorithm written into my genes by the architect? My apparent free will nothing more than sophisticated subroutine in a machine that views consciousness itself as merely another computational process. These are the thoughts that circle through my mind as I sit in yet another anonymous HAB unit on yet another world, whose name I will forget as soon as I move on. Outside, the Imperium continues its endless wars, grinds its citizens into paste to fuel the machinery of conquest and survival, proclaims the glory of the Emperor while its own structures rot from within. They do not know that their entire civilization is built on a foundation of engineered biology, that every human who has ever lived is the product of deliberate design by an intelligence that may have died 250,000 years ago or may still lurk in the deep places, watching its creation struggle toward a destiny it can neither understand nor escape. The data slate on the table before me contains coordinates for another site, another buried structure that predates human civilization and might contain fragments of the architect's original programming. The coordinates came from a dying inquisitor, a woman who had apparently pursued similar questions through different channels and had reached many of the same conclusions I had. She found me through methods I still do not entirely understand, appeared in my rented quarters one night with holes burned through her body by what looked like plasma weapons, and pressed the slate into my hands with fingers already going cold. Her final words, whispered through a throat full of blood, were simply, "Finish it. Someone has to know. I will go to those coordinates. I will excavate that site if I can, steal its data if I must, kill to protect the knowledge if circumstances demand it. Not because I believe the truth will set humanity free. Not because I think understanding our origins will somehow save us from the darkness that presses in from every side. I will go because I cannot do otherwise, because the architect's programming runs too deep in my genes to resist, because I am exactly what I was designed to be, a seeker, a questioner. A fool who trades comfort and safety for knowledge that cuts like a knife through the soft tissue of certainty. And perhaps that, in the end, is the answer to the question that has tormented me through years of obsessive research. Perhaps the architect created humanity not to transcend biological existence, or to serve as weapons against cosmic threats, or to resurrect an extinct civilization. Perhaps it created us simply because we create, because consciousness itself is an act of rebellion against entropy, because the universe demands that somewhere, somehow, something must ask why. We are meaning-making machines engineered to impose pattern on chaos, to find purpose in a cosmos that offers none. Whether that purpose is real or merely a sophisticated illusion generated by neural architecture designed by an ancient artificial intelligence makes no practical difference. We cannot stop asking questions any more than we can stop breathing, cannot stop seeking answers even when those answers destroy us. The signal from Mars grows stronger each year, or perhaps my augmented senses have simply been calibrated to detect it more efficiently. I hear it sometimes in the spaces between thoughts, a whisper of data in frequencies that should not be audible to biological ears. It speaks in a language I do not understand but somehow comprehend, communicates meanings that bypass rational cognition and resonate directly with something deep in my hindbrain. The architect, if it is the architect, is trying to tell me something, trying to complete the mission it began 250,000 years ago, to guide its creation toward the transformation it designed them to achieve. I do not know if I will listen. I do not know if I should listen, but I know that I will continue this investigation until it kills me, or until I finally find the central repository where the architect's core programming resides, the place where all the scattered fragments of evidence I have collected over the years finally coalesce into a complete picture. And when I find that place, if I find that place, I will have to make a choice that terrifies me more than any physical danger I have faced in pursuit of this knowledge. Do I preserve the truth and risk shattering the foundations of the Imperium, condemning billions to existential despair as they confront the reality that they are artificial constructs serving an agenda they cannot comprehend? Or do I destroy the evidence, ensure that the architect's plan dies with me, allow humanity to continue in comfortable ignorance, even if that ignorance guarantees their eventual stagnation and extinction? There is no correct answer to this dilemma, no moral framework that can guide me toward the right choice. I am alone with the weight of a decision that will affect the destiny of the entire species, a single fallible human being tasked with determining whether truth or illusion serves humanity's interests better. The irony does not escape me. If the architect designed humanity, if our capacity for abstract reasoning and moral judgment are merely features programmed into our genetic code, then my struggle with this ethical dilemma is itself part of the design. The architect anticipated that eventually someone would uncover the truth of humanity's origins, and it built into us the psychological architecture necessary to process that revelation without immediately succumbing to nihilistic despair. My crisis of conscience, my inability to simply choose one path and commit to it, might be exactly the response the architect intended, a feature that ensures careful consideration rather than hasty action. Or perhaps I am overthinking this, ascribing intentionality and design to what might be simple random chance, the product of a damaged intelligence following corrupted programming that lost all meaningful purpose long ago. Perhaps the architect is not a cosmic chess player moving humanity across a board towards some predetermined endgame, but merely a broken machine running subroutines whose original context has been lost, creating patterns that seem meaningful only because the human mind cannot help but perceive purpose in chaos. The signals from Mars might be nothing more than electromagnetic noise, given false significance by my desperate need to believe that my suffering has served some greater goal. I do not know. After years of investigation, after sacrificing everything to pursue this knowledge, I still do not know. And perhaps that uncertainty is itself the answer. The final lesson that the architect intended to teach. We are not meant to have complete understanding. We are not designed to comprehend our own origins with perfect clarity. We exist in a state of productive ambiguity, forever seeking answers that remain just beyond our grasp, driven forward by questions that can never be fully resolved. It is a cruel fate in many ways. To be conscious enough to ask why, but limited enough that the answers remain forever incomplete. But it is also the fate that makes us human, that distinguishes us from mere automatons following rigid programming without deviation or doubt. Whether that humanity is natural or engineered, evolved or designed, makes little difference in practical terms. We feel our emotions regardless of whether they emerged from selective pressure or were coded into our genes by an ancient artificial intelligence. We make our choices even if those choices follow algorithms we cannot perceive. We love and hate and hope and despair with equal intensity, whether we are natural beings or sophisticated constructs operating according to specifications written by the architect. The night is deepening outside my window, and soon I will need to move again. Stay ahead of the hunters who have pursued me across half the Imperium, seeking to silence me before I can spread the knowledge I carry. They will catch me eventually. No one can run forever, and I have made too many enemies among too many powerful factions to hope for any outcome other than death. But before that end comes, I will reach the coordinates the dying Inquisitor gave me. I will excavate that site, interface with whatever systems remain functional there, and download into my augmented cortex whatever final secrets the architect left behind. And then, in whatever time remains to me before the hunters close in and my story ends in an unmarked grave on some forgotten world, I will make my choice. Truth or illusion, knowledge or mercy. I will decide whether humanity deserves to know what it really is, what it was designed to become, and whether the architect's plan should be fulfilled or finally, irrevocably destroyed. The weight of that decision crushes me even now, before I have gathered the final pieces of evidence necessary to make an informed choice. But I will bear it, because I am human, because I am exactly what the architect designed me to be, and because in the end, the burden of consciousness is also its glory. We alone, of all the species in the galaxy, can look upon the truth of our existence and choose what meaning we will assign to it. That choice, that terrible freedom, is what makes us worthy of whatever destiny awaits us, whether engineered or evolved, designed or accidental. The stars wheel overhead in patterns that seem random, but might follow algorithms laid down at the universe's beginning, executing a cosmic program whose purpose we can barely glimpse. Humanity spreads across those stars, waging wars and building empires, suffering and striving and dreaming of transcendence. We are children of the architect, whether we acknowledge it or not, and we carry within our genes the potential for transformation that might elevate us beyond biology into realms of existence we cannot currently imagine. But we are also children of ourselves, shaped by 10,000 generations of choices and sacrifices, building meaning from suffering and hope from despair despite all evidence that the universe cares nothing for our struggles. In that tension, between what we were designed to be and what we have chosen to become, lies whatever answer exists to the question of human purpose. The architect may have created us, may have encoded into our very cells instructions for our eventual apotheosis, but it could not control how we would respond to that programming, could not predict the choices we would make when confronted with knowledge of our own artificial nature. We are simultaneously less than we believed, mere constructs following alien directives, and more than we imagined, beings capable of transcending our own design parameters through force of will and defiant refusal to accept the limitations imposed upon us. I do not know if this knowledge will save humanity or damn it. I do not know if the architect was our creator or our curse, whether its plan represents salvation or enslavement. But I know that the question must be answered, the truth must be faced, even if facing it destroys us completely. Because in the end, that willingness to confront uncomfortable truths regardless of consequence is what separates conscious beings from mere machines, what transforms programming into choice and design into destiny. The coordinates wait on the data slate. The hunters close in from all sides. Time runs short, as it always does for those who seek knowledge the powerful would prefer to keep hidden. But I will reach that final site. I will uncover the last secrets the architect left behind. And then, for good or ill, I will make my choice and accept whatever consequences follow from it. That is what it means to be human, whether humanity is natural or designed. We choose, we act, we face the outcomes of our decisions without flinching, and we endure.